We are 6 months into Mark Carney as the Prime Minister of Canada. The economist turned politician won the Liberal leadership race on the first ballot with over 85.9% of the vote. But he didn't have a seat in the House of Commons. In the April federal election, he won one. He also helped the party cement a fourth straight term in government, but not a majority, just shy of one, winning 168 of 343 seats. After 6 months, we ask, is the 24th Prime Minister of Canada keeping up his end of the bargain? Is Mark Carney living up to what he said he'd do in his campaign? In a politically charged world, with wars and all kinds of conflict making headlines daily, how is Mark Carney handling things? Today, we're discussing how he's doing, and of course, we want to hear from you. Call 1-800-716-2221 or send us an email, bluesky@cbc.ca. So let's get to our first guest, shall we? Jim Farney is director and professor at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina campus. We often go to him for political analysis and conversation, and today he is with me in our Regina studio. Welcome back to Blue Sky.
Thanks, Sam.
Okay, it's been 6 months since Mark Carney was elected. It feels like it's been longer than that because the news cycle is so bonkers right now. Is there something about that we don't notice it maybe as much as we may have with previous prime ministers or timelines?
Yeah, I mean, I think 6 months goes by really fast. And I was thinking walking over, like, usually a new government coming in gets 40, maybe 50 days of transition, right, where they're setting a team up and then all of a sudden we start talking about speeches from thrones and stuff. It feels more like Carney's had 6 months of that setup and that kind of throat clearing. Obviously, there has been a lot, but it kind of feels like politics took a 6-month pause.
Mm-hmm. What has stood out to you from that 6 months?
I think lots of foreign affairs stuff, right? All the European travel, all the Trump tariff stuff. That's really unusual, crucial, central, all those things. I think there's been a fundamental reset on federalism. So people might have different opinions, but from what I see, the relationships with the provinces are going much better at both the premier level, kind of Doug Ford, Premier Moe, but also at the official level. It seems that those intergovernmental tables are working again in a way that they were not under Prime Minister Trudeau. I think the Liberal Party has taken a marked shift to the right in partisan terms. We'll see how that plays out electorally. And I think a change in tone, a change in what government looks like and what it's focused on. The question now is, what does the delivery of that look like? You mentioned the budget off the top. I'm waiting for early November because there's some big promises that they've made and we don't really know yet what they look like.
When you say federalism, what do you mean for people who don't speak political?
So there are obviously Canada's got some things that are provincial jurisdiction, some things that are federal, lots that are both, and lots of fights between the two orders of government about who owns what. We have some real tensions in the Federation right now, right? Premier Smith, we've had it in Saskatchewan on our own forum under the previous government. Quebec may or may not be electing a separatist government next time. So we've had a decade of a lot of tension. It seems to me that the premiers are meeting with the Prime Minister in a way that they haven't in a long time, that those meetings are going well. And the actual formulation and delivery of policy, there are rough numbers, 800 what they call federal provincial tables, where officials and cabinet ministers sit down and try to figure out in whatever area what's actually going to happen and what does it look like. Anecdotally, I hear from people involved in those negotiations that the tone is from the feds more respectful of the provinces that it's been, that there's more willingness to move and cooperate and be flexible than it's been. And again, we'll wait and see what that shift in tone leads to in kind of things that actually affect people. But it's much easier for the provinces and the feds to work together than it's been for a while.
Would you say, I think when you talk about tension, it was also much more dramatic. Statements were a lot stronger, a lot more pointed. Is there a better or worse way to do things when you're negotiating different levels of policy with different levels of government? Like, just because it's been quieter doesn't necessarily mean it's been better or worse?
I think it's a fair point, and it's not been entirely quiet. Like Premier Smith has been pretty pointed. Doug Ford is very upset that there's not a tunnel under the 401. It's not that there aren't flashpoints in tension. But I think the American threat and the kind of shock that's hit Canada has pulled everybody together. And some of those differences that were really important 3 years ago are no longer as important. I think it's worth noting that the jury is still out on whether the same effect has happened for First Nations governments, right? The Assembly of First Nations is definitely not feeling included on the major project side. I think there are a number of nations that are more comfortable with direction. But that's a world that is so internally complex, it's harder to generalize than just having the 10 provinces.
It's funny you should mention that. We actually got an email from Jay Bird. He's a lecturer at First Nations University. He's in the Department of Indigenous Business and Public Administration, and he writes, firstly, Mark Carney came into leadership when there were serious fiscal issues between Canada and the USA, which is still happening. And we needed someone to right that ship and tackle trade problems with the United States. I believe he's done a good job of handling that portfolio and looking to expand trade within the country and provincially and with other nations globally. I think he inherited a serious fiscal problem, and he's handling that well. I would also say the polarization of politics within Canada has calmed down under Carney as the United States continues to stoke the fire south of us. If there is any drawback, it would be that his opening of natural resources within Canada has breached the concept of consultation and consent with Indigenous nations. And that issue varies province to province, region to region. He did create a working group for this, and there is hope that Indigenous advisory groups will work with First Nations communities on shoring up any issues around land, water, and environmental use of places with the development concerns. However, that's currently unknown as the working group has just begun. And I think, Jim, that might be one of the bigger concerns and criticisms we've seen is that with Mark Carney's desire to get this economy going and to get that spending and the building happening, that people who would normally be consulted are maybe being left out or worried they're going to be left out of the conversation.
Yeah, and I think it would. Hi, Jason. I think it is a really important point. The only project on his list, of the kind of first 6 national priorities I know anything about is the Foran copper mine in northern Saskatchewan. That's been the product, and it's so far advanced because there's been very substantial First Nations engagement to date. So we can hope, I think, that is ongoing. There's also, I think, the hope of some facilitation of really substantial First Nations equity partnership in these things, which is building on progress that's been made, but what is really important and new. But yes, this is a much more get things done government. And I think, as is so often the case, First Nations are kind of at the cutting edge of that. But I expect to see a lot of other types of community groups finding their relationships with the feds changed after the November budget as the public service retrenches, as there's much more emphasis on program delivery rather than policy co-creation. I think the kind of nests of stakeholder engagements that we've seen from the federal government will be rolled back, and we'll see a government that probably does less with less input from the outside in most areas.
If you're listening right now and you have thoughts on how Mark Carney has done in his first 6 months, not only as Prime Minister, but as a politician, because he has no official political background, former Governor of the Bank of Canada isn't really a political role. He engages with politicians, but was not one. Give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or send us an email, bluesky@cbc.ca. Before we get too far, I want to play some tape of Tim Hodgson. He is the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. He has a long history with Prime Minister Carney. Both came from the private sector, and he's been charged with implementing the Build Baby Build agenda. This weekend, he was a guest on CBC's Saturday political show called The House, and the host, Catherine Cullen, asked, what's something Canadians don't understand about how this Prime Minister operates?
If I gave your listeners a task, it may be more than they want, but read his book, Values. It's a tome. It's very long, but it really encapsulates who he is. He's a person of deep moral convictions. He's a person who expects more from himself than anyone else. He's a person who believes deeply in this country and believes this country can be a leader in the world. He's playing 4D chess all the time, thinking about how does he help Canada punch above its weight in the world, and how does he make sure Canadians end up in the best place possible.
That was Tim Hodgson, the Federal Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, talking about Prime Minister Mark Carney. That book, Values, was released in 2021, written before he had any idea, or maybe he did have an idea, but before there was any public conversation about Mark Carney becoming leader of the Liberal Party or him becoming Prime Minister of Canada. Jim, you've read Values. I did read the first third. It is long. I will, and I am not an economist by any means, but I'm curious if you want to summarize the values he lays out in the book, because I found the whole premise of it fascinating.
Yeah, so it got a lot of attention when it came out for what he said about environmental policy, but that was really an application. That's the last third of the book. The first third, which it's a great time, is really a review of the history of economics as a discipline and trying to wrestle with this problem of if you're focused on financial data, on market data, on basically money, you might end up knowing the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And so he's trying to make an argument to say, yes, we need to pay attention to the economy and to data, but we need to pay attention to a bunch of other stuff that we care about that is harder to put into financial numbers. We care about having a clean environment. We care about sometimes people talk about a well-being index of people being healthy and happy. How can we look at these moments in the evolution of economics as a discipline and find ways to make it more humane, to have a more rounder and kind of fulsome sense of what a good life looks like than just naked economic efficiency? One of the crossovers in that argument that I haven't seen him speak about, but I'm just curious personally, we also know that he's a observant, maybe not devout, but observant Catholic. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of crossover between a kind of Christian tradition of looking for human dignity and some of the critiques of mainstream economics he was making in the book. So it's a very careful thinking through of, what is human dignity put up against economic rationality and measurement.
The way I summarized it to our producer, Nicole, yesterday was value can have two meanings. There's our personal values, and then there's financial values. Yeah. And the way we put value on things is interesting. On the back of the book, it says, when we think about what we as individuals value most highly, we might list fairness, health, the protection of our rights, economic security from poverty, the preservation of natural diversity, resources, and beauty. The tragedy is these things that we hold dearest are too often the casualties of our 21st century world where they ought to be our bedrock. So that we get so caught up in capitalism and money and making sure the books are the way the books are that we forget about why we started doing it in the first place.
Yeah, and I think he has, walked back some of the economic applications of those. Where I'm seeing the application of that set of questions and thinking right now is on Canadian nationalism. He is a very nationalist in the sense of the English past, the French past, the First Nations reality. But he talks about that as a very important overlapping set of communities in a way that Mr. Trudeau did not, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that part of the nationalist bent he's got is grounded in the sense that belonging to community matters and those real communities need to be protected and encouraged.
Do you think he's governing with these values that he wrote about, though? Do you see the Mark Carney of the 2021 publication in this 2025 Prime Minister?
I do, but he is also an incredible pragmatist, right? I don't think he is a particularly ideological figure. He is, I think, at his core, someone with a set of principles who also likes solving wicked problems. And I think as Prime Minister, what we're seeing is someone trying to solve wicked problems almost as a technocrat.
So speaking of that, this book was written before Trump was reelected, before the tariffs that had the ever-changing goalposts. I think that's funny given what the CFL did yesterday, but the ever-changing goalposts, the wars in Ukraine, the war in Gaza. Do you think the world events have changed his values or priorities?
I think
publicly speaking, obviously you don't have a close personal relationship with him.
I think it's changed his focus. He had put a lot of effort into rethinking basically the financial system and the environment and ecology. That's on the back burner now as he looks more at kind of some very foundational economic systems, Canadian economy, Canadian governing pieces. But remember that he came to prominence in Canada as we responded to the 2008-09 financial crisis and became governor of the Bank of England kind of just in the lead up and then just after Brexit. And as a very young public servant in the Federal Department of Finance, played some important roles in the kind of post-95 Canadian fiscal crisis fallout. So
are you saying he's a fixer?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to find anybody with more crisis management experience than he's got.
I'm thinking of the show Scandal, and Olivia Pope comes to mind. And I'm not saying that he does bad things to get where he needs to go, like happens in the TV show, but that's the first thing that comes to mind is like someone who always manages to swoop in and fix the thing as best they can in the moment. So you're saying he has a history of being a fixer?
Yeah, I was thinking more a throwback to the 90s and Mr. Wolf, but yeah, I can go with a better pop culture reference.
I mean, if you're going to go with anything, Shonda Rhimes has an answer to everything. Okay, I want to bring in our next, on that note, let's bring in our next guest. Paul Merriman is a former Saskatchewan Party MLA. He's also now senior counsel with Prairie Sky Strategy. He was part of our Blue Sky federal political panel leading up to the federal election. He's with us now in our Saskatoon studio. Welcome back to Blue Sky.
Thanks very much for having me back, Sam.
Okay, you've been listening in. What are thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Well, I agree that the federalism side of things is better. I think that the bar was pretty low before in the previous administration where it was very divisive politics. It was East-West, it was non-Indigenous, Indigenous, it was environmental, you were with us or against us type of philosophy that was coming out of Ottawa. What I'm seeing is that the perception is Prime Minister Carney is putting Canada first, is listening to the premiers instead of putting Ottawa first. And that's what I saw in the previous administration, that Ottawa was, and I was in those meetings as we were talking about all those different tables that Jim was referencing. I was in those meetings with federal ministers at the time, various different portfolios, and the perception from the provinces was, not speaking for all of them, was here's what we're doing from Ottawa. And that was always a pushback from like, hold on, this doesn't work in Saskatchewan, this doesn't work in New Brunswick or in the territories. Well, make it work. And that was a very difficult position for us to be in because we thought we were in a collaborative position that we could sit down, you would bring our ideas, understanding that it's not going to work in every region, but there has to be some exceptions and some input from the provinces. We weren't getting that before, certainly not with Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet. It was very top-down. You just look at the history of how many times the Prime Minister met with all of the premiers. It was very minimal, very little contact on that. Now, from what I'm hearing from my former colleagues and from the Premier, it is collaborative. Prime Minister Carney saying all the right things. He's meeting. He's taking those difficult discussions. And I believe at heart he's trying to put Canada in a better spot. What we have to be conscious of is for the last 10 years we were used to the great speaking lines and the great taglines. We needed to see the rubber hit the road. And we're starting to see that with the announcement of the 5 But to be fair, those 5 projects are not going to kickstart our economy to be able to outpace our spending right now. Our spending, our commitment to NATO, our commitment to lots of fronts, the spending that's coming out, and I'm going to be very closely watching the budget, especially on the Indigenous side of things, to see if there's any cutbacks on that. I'm hoping they're not, because we're seeing some great success in there. But I want to make sure that the rubber will hit the road, because we've been fed the lines by Ottawa before out west. It's stoking what's happening in Alberta. And we need to all put our support in behind this country, not necessarily behind the decisions that are being made in Ottawa.
I want to talk to you about that, the Alberta situation, because we know that Danielle Smith has some kind of relationship with Donald Trump. She's been at Mar-a-Lago. She's been in pictures with him. We've seen lots of conversation come out of Alberta related to what's going on in the United States and vice versa. I'm wondering how that's changed, and if that was something that maybe you saw coming regardless of who was prime minister, and that's just the path that Alberta was on, or if things have changed since Carney became prime minister.
I think that there's definitely a frustration in Alberta. I mean, that's obvious. What Premier Smith is choosing to do is trying to represent her constituents in the best way possible, and what her constituents, and we all have lots of family and friends in Alberta. There was a mass exodus of Saskatchewan. That's why there's lots of Rider fans down at the Edmonton game and at the Calgary game. Is we have those friends there, and they're telling us the same thing. They're frustrated. They want to be able to grow their economy. They want to be able to live the lifestyle out west that they've worked hard for, and they're very held back by, previously it was environmental restrictions, very, very tough regulations on the environment, on getting any projects done. And now Prime Minister Carney is fast-tracking that, which is good. And there's some great representation on that. Chief Darcy Bear, I believe, is on one of those committees. And the Métis Nation also has representatives on there. What I think is happening in Alberta is just a general louder frustration of what's happening in Western Canada. We just want to be heard. We just want to be able to have every opportunity that they have in Eastern Canada. When something happens in Eastern Canada, such as the auto sector, everybody jumps. It's on the national news. We hear about it. Something happens in Toronto. Everybody hears about it. What's happening within the canola sector is pretty much being ignored, other than Premier Moe going out and taking charge of this, and then going to Ottawa and explaining it with the producers to say how critical this is, not just to Saskatchewan, but to the overall Canadian economy. I'm glad that Prime Minister Carney took that meeting. I think we need to see some action on some of the commitments that he's made. And after his first 6 months, the expectation is we need to see what's actually going to happen.
I'm Sam McKeag. Today we are talking about 6 months since Mark Carney became Prime Minister of Canada. The timeline, if you want a refresher, because I feel like it feels like it's been more than 6 months. And in some ways it feels like it just happened. March 14th of this year, he was sworn in as Canada's 24th Prime Minister. April 28th of this year is when he won his seat in the federal election and returned the Liberals to government. And then this spring summer is when he launched the housing plan, trying to promote the One Canadian Economy Act to reduce interprovincial trade barriers and navigate this escalating U.S. trade tariffs, trade war, trade situation we have with our neighbors to the south. Mark Carney was the second youngest person to ever serve as the governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013. Then he became the first non-British person to become governor of the Bank of England. He studied at Harvard, he studied at Oxford, and he started his career at Goldman Sachs and then recently worked for Brookfield Asset Management, a global investment firm. Everything I've read about this man tells me he is used to being one of the smartest people in the room. And that is complicated when you are trying to have conversations with some of the most important people in the world, because with importance often comes ego. We see that with some of the biggest leaders in the world. I can point directly to the United States as an example. I'm wondering, Paul, are there any moves that Mark Carney has made so far in the last 6 months that have surprised you?
I think the rebuilding the relationship as quickly with the United States, and it's been back and forth. I mean, I think that he's certainly has. I don't know if he has President Trump's ear, but he's at least opened up a communication line, which seems to be good because we didn't have that before. So that's impressive. The meetings with the premiers, I think that's extremely impressive that he's taking those meetings. He's actually listening, and from whatever what I'm hearing is he's taking the issues seriously. I think you're capturing it very accurately with saying he is a fixer. He can go in and fix these problems. But the problems are complex, more complex than banking, more complex than working in a large corporation. These are emotional issues that he is dealing with, and that's a little different than you're dealing with corporate or financial issues. These are emotional issues. You have a very large diversity across the country. But I think he's doing well. I want to see what's going to happen in the next 6 months. We've got a budget coming up in November, assuming there's going to be a budget coming up in the spring. We've got 2 budgets. Are they going to go back to the polls? Are they going to use this as a lever to get a majority government? But in all, I would say he's doing a good job. If he can deliver on some of these things, I'll change my tune and say he's doing a great job.
On the continuum of terrible to great, he's somewhere in the good range.
Yes.
Jim, what about you? What is he in your... I mean, as a political scientist, you're talking about this with students and colleagues, no doubt. What's coming up in conversations as you talk about what Mark Carney has done in the last 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, very much my list is like Paul's, right? It's the relationships with the provinces, with the feds. I think the kind of key tests that I'm very curious to see how they land sit at the intersection of politics and policy. So I think the danger for him, given his background and his bent, even his personality, is to think of the Canadian economy as growing and resilient while listening to Bay Street. Mm-hmm. It's clear that there's lots of pressures on, people's grocery budgets, on affording housing. Like, we are in a cost of living crisis. And if there is a danger or a thing I'm watching for this fall with a lot of curiosity is, can this kind of Save Canada focus on the economy piece also cover off kind of the day-to-day economics of people? Mm-hmm. I think there's going to be an attempt there, but the advisors he has, the support base of the Liberals, the way they framed the crisis, I don't think it's front of mind for them in the way that it is for some of the other parties.
When you, Paul mentioned, will they go back to the polls? How long do you think it will take for one of the opposition parties to say, well, I guess there is only one, for the opposition party to say, no, we're done. Let's go back to the polls?
Well, there's 4, and it's so close that they all matter. I think the Tories are ready to go now with Mr. Poilievre back in the office, and they're good for fundraising. The NDP is just starting a leadership race, so I do not imagine they will want to go. Although there is now so much distance between the government agenda and their own, it will be tempting on policy terms, but they have no money and no leader and no organization, so they're not in a place to pull it. Quebec politics remains a mystery to me, and but
I appreciate your honesty.
But the leadership of this party, once you get below Carney himself, has a lot of senior ministers from Quebec. A lot of the senior officials are from Quebec. I don't expect any tragic missteps that lead to an unanticipated election because they alienate that province. So I do think we have a little bit of time. We'll get through the fall budget for sure. Maybe there's something in the spring that causes one of the other parties to pull their support. But between the domestic political position and this massive American threat, I don't think we're headed into election anytime soon. You
did mention the potential for Quebec to elect a separatist government next go round. I'm wondering about the tone of separatism. There was a much stronger tone last year, right. Even lots of conversations, particularly in Western Canada. How have you seen that change? So
I might as well go full nerd and answer your question. I think I've been trying to think who are Carney's two comparators, and I think the answer is Brian Mulroney and Prime Minister Bennett. Bennett, because if things don't work out well for him, it's just like having the luck of becoming Prime Minister at the start of the Great Depression. There's really nothing you're going to do to change the fundamentals. Mulroney, because he came in with this very ambitious agenda on too many files. And he ended up not getting some of the core things over the goal line because he had so many commitments. I think with Carney, there's a danger that he needs to do so much so quickly, he will end up with a similar kind of breadth of effort that falls short. And I think the Quebec piece could be part of that story. He could run into the same Quebec-Alberta autonomous thing that gummed up so much of the Mulroney agenda 40 years ago.
That's not nearly as nerdy as I was expecting.
I try.
Paul, any thoughts on that, on the separatist movement? I mean, you talked about Alberta and the frustration there. We've seen some of the more further right-leaning supporters still talking about not wanting to be part of Canada anymore as it stands. What are you hearing from your former colleagues and even in your consulting firm in terms of separatism and one Canada versus, maybe not a federation?
I think lots of people are talking about it, but when you ask the kind of second and third level questions, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to separate from Canada? Like if Alberta says we want to separate, okay, what does that exactly look like to you? And then it kind of gets the waters get a little muddier and muddier and muddier, and it's what it comes down to at the end of the day is we want a better deal. They want to be Canadian, but they don't want to be manipulated or controlled by policies in Ottawa that are out of touch with what's happening in Alberta and to a greater extent Western Canada. I think if there was a separatist movement in Quebec, which we've seen multiple times in multiple generations, that this is cyclical within Quebec. Out west, it's been there under the surface for a while. I think things are calming down right now. But I when you ask, what is it? Do you want to have your own dollar? Do you want to have your own, get out of the Canadian pension plan? What's your defense budget? How do you actually do this? And do you think this is just going to flip a switch within the term of any government? Like a separation from Canada would take years and years to be able to unwind. And I'm not a constitutionalist, but it's not an overnight thing, and it's not going to fix everybody's problems. So I think it's more of an emotional reaction. And when you start getting down into the logic of it, I think the discussion loses a lot of weight with the average person because they're frustrated. They want a better deal. They don't know how to get a better deal other than to say, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And I think if you, when you really ask them, they still want to be Canadians, but they want to be able to have a better deal from Ottawa. And I think Prime Minister Carney has the opportunity. I think if Prime Minister Carney wants some wins, he has to look at what can he manage within Canada to be able to get some wins. Some of the canola and the Trump, those are things that are somewhat out of his control. The canola, I think he can manage, but there's geopolitical. What about interprovincial trade barriers? Something that they can definitely work on with what's in our control, within the Premier's control, that would open up an economic floodgate. Those are the things that I think he should be focused on to be able to bring up the economy in Canada. Is what is it we can control as politicians? What can Ottawa and the provinces and the territories control to be able to open this up versus things that are happening in Europe or south of the 49th or over in China, which are certainly out of the provincial jurisdiction and a very much challenge as Canada because we are so closely tied to the U.S.
Okay, I want to read an email. We did invite back all the members of our partisan federal political panel, but Claire and Doug were not able to join us today. But Claire Card. She teaches at the Western College of Veterinary Medicine, and she previously ran for the federal NDP. She was part of that panel. She writes, How is Mark Carney doing? In my view, we've elected a progressive conservative who's been compelled to focus on the impacts of the disruptive policies of Donald Trump. This includes the impacts of the arbitrary tariffs, immigration matters, Canada's sovereignty, international affairs, and defense. On handling Trump sees the Goldman Sachs Brookfield Assets man as a member of his own tribe. In general, the relationship with Trump is functional, but the caving in on the digital services tax was a mistake. Upcoming UMSCA negotiations will be telltale. The action on the domestic issues of housing affordability, job security, immigration, refugees, China relations, Palestine, support for Ukraine, national unity have not been as focused. The expectation of rapid housing action seems unattainable, and the plan of mainly using corporate housing solutions is not what an NDP government would support. The NDP would support getting Canada back into publicly funded cooperative housing in a big way. This is a decision that is better for people rather than corporations. The immigration limits on students have been very damaging to the main Canadian universities who were not the abusers. On this file, the federal government gets an F. The government is tone deaf to hearing the concerns of the big universities whose enrollment was greatly impacted. This policy, without correction, also hurts Canada's innovative agenda, as foreign graduate students are needed for innovation. And unlike the USA, Canadian corporations do not do their fair share of research and development. Meanwhile, the Conservatives rail against the temporary foreign workers, but they were architects of the program with the purposely baked-in weaknesses. What is most surprising? Two things. The NDP perspective would include that the pre-existing environmental protections and commitments should be kept and adjusted to make polluters pay. Carney was a former UN envoy with an environmental portfolio. Greening the economy will have long-term benefits and align us more closely with the EU. This is needed for our long-term competitiveness and prosperity. Second, his hockey-loving, elbows-up, running a marathon persona is much more approachable than I thought it would be. And that comes to us from Claire Card, who is part of our Partisan political federal panel. Paul, you were part of that panel. Any thoughts on what Claire had to say?
Well, it's a little disappointing that 98% of that was all negative. I mean, there are some things, and I'm not politically agreeing with Prime Minister Carney on everything either, but I am giving the benefit of the doubt of trying to be righting the ship here, because he did get the ship when it was taking a lot of water. Post-COVID, post-Trudeau, there was a lot of issues. So I do give credit where credit is due. I hate to say it, but on the federal scene, I don't think the NDP's voice is certainly not as loud as it was. I mean, there's no news. We never see anything about the NDP anymore. And they seem to be pulling further and further left. But I would hope that maybe Claire could see something that Prime Minister Carney is working with the provinces on some specific issues. And I'm hopeful he can deliver on those, and I hope that all Canadians can see it.
Okay. Any thoughts, Jim, on what Claire had to say?
Yeah, a couple. I mean, obviously, this is not like she's right. This is a progressive conservative, if those creatures still existed, style of government. I think the housing piece is really interesting because it's clearly a massive problem for people. It's one of these complicated areas of shared jurisdiction that the feds got out of in the late 1990s. There are some things that the federal government can do, but many of the issues are really at the municipal and the federal level. So big promises, limited ability to deliver. How does it roll out? I will disagree. He recognized Palestine as a state this morning. I have been surprised by the shift in that regard. I know many of my friends would like to see something stronger, but that's still a very substantial shift that's gone on.
It's something.
Well, yeah, and it's a break with a kind of fairly long-term Canadian history, and something that is substantial. I think the immigration piece is a good example of the type of change in style that I was talking about earlier. There was very little consultation with universities. There was a decision made, and the sector that I'm in is having to respond to it, but there were a clear set of problems. And so these are changes that started under Trudeau, but it's clear the government made a decision that it was moving in a direction. I will not be surprised to see future decisions made after consultation with the provinces, but not after consultation with the laundry list of civil society or business or university groups that we had gotten used to. And yeah, that can lead to some very substantial changes very quickly.
I want to touch on the Palestine statehood recognition. It's something that Pierre Poilievre has said they would not have done. This is what Pierre Poilievre posted. He said, Prime Minister Mark Carney is recognizing the Hamas state in another effort to distract from his record of rampant crime, costs, debt, immigration, and job loss. As he distracts abroad, Conservatives are working at home. Our priority is to put Canada first, restoring stronger take-home pay, safer streets, and secure borders with a self-reliant country. Prime Minister Mark Carney's priority is creating a Hamas state that will reward terrorists for raping civilians, taking hostages, oppressing Palestinians, and launching a war. Conservatives will also stand for Israel's right to exist and defend itself, living next to a future demilitarized, terror-free, democratic, and peaceful Palestinian state. Conservatives will focus on what is good for Canada because it is time to put our country first for a change. You touched off the top, Jim, about how he has done so much internationally in this first 6 months, and maybe not as much at home. He has met with premiers and provinces. What is your thought on him going against the U.S. on this? We know Poilievre doesn't agree with it, but what do you make of him going against? Because Trump will not do that. He said he'll support whatever happens after they figure it out. We'll support you. Right.
I think, I mean, the decision vis-a-vis the U.S., we are trying to pivot a little bit to Europe, and I see that in the other countries that made the announcement today. It's a really, good's not the right word, it's a really hard example of something that's growing more important in our politics, which is whether it's Israel-Palestine, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's the relationship with the United States, whether it's kind of diasporic politics at the local level. More and more the Canadian border doesn't end partisan politics. And I think as a country, we need to find a way to have discussions about what our national interest is that are somehow not partisan on these really important global issues. And I see a danger that we start where the political leadership is tempted to start using, international humanitarian or foreign policy questions to domestic partisan advantage. I think that's too bad, but it's something that it's been a long time since we've had it so central to kind of domestic party politics. And so there's a number of those files right now that I hope we can find a way to kind of muddle through carefully.
I want to talk about, we talked about Danielle Smith very briefly, but I want to go back to her. Speaking of partisan politics, as you mentioned there, host Jamie Poisson is the host of Front Burner. Danielle Smith was on Front Burner. You can listen to Front Burner wherever you get your podcasts. There's their little plug. But she asked her what she sees, what Danielle Smith sees from a Mark Carney government that is good for Alberta. This is what she said.
I would say the jury is still out. I'm hopeful that this is a true change of direction. I've seen some positive signs. I mean, when I look at this current prime minister, I have to look at his actions through the realm of, or through the lens of, would Justin Trudeau, his predecessor, have done this? And I'll tell you the things that I'm encouraged by. Number one, when he first got elected, he got rid of the carbon tax. Justin Trudeau would not have done that. Number two is that he campaigned on making Canada the strongest economy in the G7 and being an energy superpower on both conventional as well as renewable energy. I don't think Justin Trudeau would have done that. He did create a major projects pathway so that we can get major projects approved within 2 years. Again, that's a new policy. On that project list, you have 4 projects, which are resource development projects. So that's an affirmation that that's the direction he's going. And also he put the project office in Calgary and put Dawn Farrell at the helm of it. And she was the CEO, of course, of Trans Mountain Pipeline, which did get built to the coast. So let me add one more. He has also suspended, for now, pending a further review, the net zero vehicles, which is one of the 9 bad laws that I think had to be reviewed. So I'm seeing some positive indication that he's moving in the right direction. That being said, we don't have a bitumen pipeline to the BC coast, a new one, because I think we do need another 1 million barrel per day pipeline. We haven't seen a repeal of the worst laws, the emissions cap, the greenwashing bill, and the net zero power regs, which are absolutely, and the tanker ban, which are absolutely essential to be able to do some meaningful development of our energy sector in Alberta. We're having good conversations, and so I think he certainly understands the perspective that we have on that. But I'm waiting to see if we can get to a grand bargain agreement, and that means bitumen pipeline, the Pathways project to decarbonize the existing oil sands operations on the upstream, as well as significant movement on the 9 bad laws in order to create a better investment climate.
That was Danielle Smith speaking with Jamie Poisson on Front Burner. You can listen to their full conversation wherever you get your podcasts. Paul, is there anything surprising in what she had to say there?
Well, if it's a softening of the message that was there a year ago. I mean, when Premier Smith said the jury's still out, that's a significant shift from where they were 12 months ago, where there was, I don't want to say a hatred, but a very strong, no love lost, a very strong negative emotional reaction to Prime Minister Trudeau, the policies out of Ottawa, and so it's a softening. So as Premier Smith, they're indicating some things are moving right, and I think Premier Moe has done that as well, that we are moving in the right direction. The 9 bad laws, I'm not sure what all 9 of them are, but I'm pretty sure that they're handcuffing Alberta. We have to look at how can we export what we have here to the world. The world wants what we have in Canada. And how do we get that out? And we can't trip over ourselves. The province can't trip over themselves. The federal government can't put barriers on. We have to do this with an environmental lens on it, but not being completely controlled by every environmental theory that is put out there or action. We need to make sure that we're growing our economy in a sustainable, environmental way with our Indigenous partners, not just as supportive, but as economic partners, so we can create some economic stability within our Indigenous communities.
I want to read an email we got from Moreno. I'm just going to read the beginning of it because it is a lengthy email, but I think it's an interesting point. Moreno writes, all one should expect from Canada's leadership in this very new and highly transactional world is for the leadership to be experienced in global socioeconomic matters, be diplomatic in person so as to gain Canada more trusted trading partners. Mark Carney excels in all the skills Canada and Canadians need in this juncture. Remember, Mark Carney does not need this job. He could be in a hammock on a beach right now. He is giving a considerable amount of time in his life to help Canada get through a tough time. And I think that is an interesting point when you consider he has had many successful tenures in other positions. Paul, what are your thoughts on that as someone who is a former politician?
Yeah. Is he coming into it with the right reasons? Yes, absolutely. Does he need the job? No. I don't think, Prime Minister Trudeau needed the job either. He seemed to be pretty well healed before he got into politics. But, with his international experience, it is an asset. We didn't have that before. And I would say, jumping back to Prime Minister Harper, he had some international experience, very economically well-versed, and very similar to Mark Carney in that. Not the same portfolio, but economically sound. And I think we need that. We are in debt, and we are heading towards a very dangerous cliff. I'm worried about my kids. I'm worried about my kids paying down that debt. And I don't know how we're going to do that. But I would say, yeah, Prime Minister Carney's on the right path. He does have the tools in his toolbox, so to speak, to be able to help us out as a country. But he also needs the support of his colleagues, which a lot of them are from the previous administration, to be able to enact his vision of the new Canada.
Jim, before we wrap up the show here, this has gone by very quickly. What are you watching to see if the next 6 months, that'll give us a year of Mark Carney, are a success?
I mean, I think it's really implementation, and I think you can riff off of the question you asked Paul. I don't think he psychologically needs the job. And one of the questions in my head is, does he psychologically need to win the next election? Or is the mental checklist he's got is a series of things he wants to see done? Mm-hmm. This is his most senior public servant is 72. This is clearly Michael Sabia's last big job. So I don't know if it's going to be an electoral one. It's going to be how many of these big projects, these big changes, does he get done in the next whatever length of time.
Jim, Paul, thanks so much for your insight and for a great conversation today. I appreciate you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.